I'm completely delighted to be speaking or kind of listening to Ollie read his poems from this kind of beautiful new book, Sleepers Awake Tonight. Ollie is the author of 4 kind of collections of poetry, Between Two Windows, Within Habit, Blotter, Sleepers Awake, a wonderful novel, Lorem Ipsum, and a book of criticism, John Ashbery, An Anglo-American Exchange. He lives in Glasgow and teaches at the University of St Andrews, and is also a wonderful critic. Sleepers Awake is an astonishingly inventive sequence of poems about desire, parenting, the experience of experience, bureaucracy, relating, living life on screens, and the fierce breathlessness of recognition that emerges as the blunt, humdrum, naked technological rhythms of everyday life. The poems are light, crisp, modest, gorgeous, playful, and inviting. You, we, the reader, are caught up in the drama of wanting to know something new about the world, in the dream of presence and nearness, which is intimacy, but also an acknowledgement that knowing the other is the only way of arriving at knowing something original about ourselves, and also of getting to know the world differently. Reading the poems, you feel more situated in time, in the confusion of living through the fiddly melodies, to quote Ollie, that make up the sound of our days. The poems occupy a nearby space of the mind's reality where something is constantly swinging, swooping, slipping into view. They show how the text of our life becomes stranger and clearer the more that it is turned over in the mind of the poem, the more words that are found to talk about the feeling of experience, and a poetry that impinges, again to quote Ollie, on the world's copyright. The poems move through sound. They sing, to quote the wonderful long poem, progress real and imagined, the sting in listening. As in W.S. Graham's writing, the listener finds himself a protagonist in the poem, only here the poem's world is chattier, less abstract, and acutely interested in the life of words, and what it means not only to live in language in the abstract, but to live in it materially, to hear the oddity of the location and the sound of our own voice reverberating like thought inside us. I almost lurch to punch my own voice, crushingly loud in AirPods, cancelling the more of shuffled spruce we hear and composed at Erdberg. The poem's wordplay, the musicality of its thought, alerts us to what the wonderful late poet Lynn Heginian calls the audacious science of the thought of poetry. The clarification of the world is a constant undressing, a desire not to know, but to understand what it is to desire to know, and what it is to experience, what it is to be a person, an idea that can only be lived out in real time as a work in progress, as a constant feeling of anxiety that can never be resolved, and which attunes us to other anxieties and emergencies that are going on around us. This openness to what it is to be a person, what it is we do when we think ourselves into poetry, allows an astonishingly generous, mobile, clarifying way of reading and inhabiting the world. I think of lines like the parade de l'être, I probably mispronounced that, in a visible voice note, and a paradise from another collection that seems to be roughly that of Japan. A grid is applied to the image from which the object has been extracted and begins to spur it. What more do we need to know about the worlds we desire and imagine, only that we have to go on desiring and imagining in unpropitious circumstances. But this imagining is also pushed up against a hilarious modesty, as in the morning sky, right about 8:47 a.m., as Ollie writes, in buttery, what a boutery, which is shambolic red pink, and then those clouds, though, in cred. At a matter-of-fact prosiness, the riddles of languages, seductions, and the movements between the comforts and discomforts of living out a bodily life emerge poems that are curious and alert to the collective disturbance in our dreams, as Ollie writes in a poem, which I definitely can't pronounce, Ding, Fingen, Dict, and hopefully we will have a chance to talk about these titles. The poems are chatty and alert. They're wittily open towards everything and towards the ongoing strangeness of feeling, which is approached with a tender skepticism and a sardonic surprise. Confusion is painful, spacious. What if every time you laugh, you were sick? Like Nicole Eisenman's painting from from which the long poem Progress Real and Imagine takes its name. The poem is about the making of poetry in real time, about the swamping of the space of the poem with the imagining of it, of the rhythms and misunderstanding, the fear of not knowing yourself at all, the fear of knowing yourself too exactly, at the tangle of the promise of simplicity. And the poem goes about its dazzling meditative insights, extracting the awe from boredom, producing lines that are awe-inspiring in their off-the-cuff humility and their desire to be overheard exhaustively. These are poems written between the synapse, the scroll, the childcare routine, reading Bernadette Meyer, a strike donut, and the luscious meditations on that thing we call nature, which is of course what we make of it. Sleepers Awake is, to quote one of Ollie's poems, a punch in the middle soul, the release of sudden vents of feeling, and the feeling is a sudden tenderness, a hallucinatory clarity that catches you unawares, because the poems proceed in a light, semi-distracted manner, giving the impression that poetry is merely something that happens between everything else, which transforms everything else. These are poems that make you hear the kink, the crease, the tear in reality, which is, of course, the best writing can do. So I'll hand over to Ollie, who will make all this much clearer for about 30 minutes, I believe. I believe he'll be starting with his wonderful long poem, Progress Real or Imagined.
Thank you so much, Jess, for that incredibly generous introduction, which was amazing to listen to. And thank you, Jazz, for organising this event, and to everyone at Carcanet for producing this beautiful object. I'm really pleased to be here tonight to read a little bit of the book to you. As just mentioned, I'm going to start by reading the first kind of 25 pages or so of the long poem that is at the beginning of the book, Progress Real and Imagined, and then I'll read probably a couple more shorter poems from later in the book. As Jess mentioned, this is a kind of semi or very loosely ekphrastic poem, in the sense that around 50 pages in, it starts to mention the painting by Eisenman, which is an extraordinary piece, but kind of takes a while to get there through various digressions and so on. So the poem comes with an epigraph from The Two Gentlemen of Verona, which is, "Why stand under and understand is all one." For a long time, I wondered, what's all this juice for? To bring us closer? To touch or meet you here in this small downed room, take the sensation of eyes moving as a totem, alive and Googling the anonymous green blossom humming in the air out of frame. Oh, Johannes, there you are. A little word for the prose. Are we to piece together a spillage on the still page, so an ache still may take place in public? Location plate, just happy to live from work in the milky circle. The light is matte on my hand, and my clack is how many motets nuanced by the gross interiors of freshly transparent minsters to bump eyes on, take dictation from the lordliest pace of field activity from which senile snail shell and irritating if melismatic churning noise emerges. Go back a bit to hover read the sharpened block for rain to be tomentoes. The day is itchy with desire not to show how much I wants to show, it said to myself, hoping to be overthrown. Morning plaza, wet grass, glass recycling overflow. I seem to wander in a specious field, the canal as clear as +1, the bus late. The medieval poet remains a leisure deity, bizarre, I accept. I fancied Britishness evenly distributed among arrow keys, spacebar drizzling lightly inside a pause in applause. Reading Peppa Pig upside down, difficulty bludgeons me as memorable, my own performance of exhaustion memorable. News of knives and forks, neuter of contrafactus. I remember the shadow of the bank headquarters as an enormous see-through parfait. 5 p.m. unfolding a moot song. Mute the time and something increases inside me, unfolds a clear aesthetic goal. Secure what the historical pet felt like. Here we are at capacity, the slump between clarity and unhappiness, trivial reprieve. If you're happy and you know it, is it worth it? Sun plugged into song. Nothing more real than boredom, a feeling of oblong, dreamlessness. Gardener father, teacher mother, Shapes of non-human exactness, put this down, pick this up afresh, I can barely put the dishes away kind of aesthetic. Tiny brown, black, white and beige dots, the nail of my index finger, an injury pitched just below the threshold of interest, voice breaking in 10-minute previews. My insexual style is to encourage and complain at the same time, a flickering momentary hallucination. I have no idea why light changes, pavement swallows, last leaf bits capsize and expiry air. Nothing is so beautiful as when you say, okay, reluctantly, you can tell me your funded dream about daylight. Thursday's daily buffering of quondam form, beleaguerable sense. Last night, one or the other stirred, coughed, or wept in his sleep. This morning, the ample shadow of the maple gums the pavement. Staring at people longingly or sadly from a distance of 8 inches, an almost physically painful task, like suddenly yourself brushed you and shushed. Still waiting for something to cling to the latticework of the feeling. Blue light, green leaf, a whole useless sensory life, IP31812392234, timestamp 2020-06-04-11-11:30 UTC. For a long time, exhaustion and its ostentatious display were a big part of the work. For a long time, the labor was thinking about the fictional workplace the thinking doesn't happen in. True, by that point, the object is swallowed by language, though by that point, language has itself become an object. So there is a way to be exact and at the same time stupid, a commonplace, where I am strange like the ballooning nimbus, where you have just a few memories, a special rejection of the recently discovered ears of earth, where is it worth it? Here I appear to pause. Here impose a pair appears. I put that in to make it more hummy. Is it worth it? The daily catastrophe of the camouflage bigger than the head. What is being done and only just in plain sight and historic address in anachronistic dress. True, childhood was a weak creation, avoiding work, however, book 1 previews in late August. Fold the pages, cut them and stuff into the mouth and eyes. Thus, accidents and poetry descend directly from the sky, fluting my phone, yodeling in the beanflower, trying to remember the basics, trying to remember spring is a bourgeois climate, Boris fucking Becker. Once again, only one form, theft or dramatization of a dogmatic theory, or wait for light to detail Tuesday air. Okay, so it's February, and death is a medium of exemplary blandness, which represents an opportunity for new forms of expressiveness, so said the designated driver. So I said something so familiar like, with staying up to date, am I even able to close my eyes? But someone looked at me today through the window and my insides capsized. Oh, Johannes, reflect on that. White glove, flouting the form, twatting a thrush straight out the sky, poetry without any ideas in it, brimming with a real stupidity. Little dots of brownish white flicked against the pane and dried, paddled, mottled lake, sweet. Extracting the awe from boredom, listening to the language, talking to itself. To alter what it says, I write myself to sleep, where I am moved slightly by analog music, by analogy with scratches, striations in the 4 seasons, the only music I've ever heard. It's like there was actually no information to be had, except what you doodle while on the landline. What kind of child was anyone? I don't really hear him, except when I confuse with myself you. Does it really feel like this, where we are nose to nose in an aluminium drum? A transparent sphere living colored in, feels tight in the aluminium drum of the memory of the things I liked. Confusion is painful, spacious. What if every time you laughed you were sick? I was writing this in bed, the children thrown to sleep, and thought I heard rain, and then out the window, though it took a while, the trees started to nod. For a long time, I was trying to visualize a long and tangled root system, a signature in the soil when you asked if I was listening. Days pass. It has something to do with this glitch upon which this has come to depend. Sorry, when I try to strike a deal, my children who don't accept the premise of work hallucinate themselves out of earshot. At the picket, the standing around a native time, unconvinced CD&E receive a bunch of anxious emails as though some conviction could crystallize from the intersection of external convictions. A vector of sweetness, vital, trivial, gold is formed during the death of a star. There you are. One poem, but inside it hundreds of smaller poems, each with an agenda of its own. Pupae in the rotten bark we pick off minty. A stump that kills an hour 10 weeks into an indeterminate period. My phone has been hacked. I Google in the hope it might spook the hacker. It's not that I want to be surveilled exactly, but there's emails you might be interested in. It's hard not to be touched when someone really listens, haha. Back to office expression on my face, knowing you're being duped, kind of enjoying it, watching the image of the plane you're on, humming during sex, shaving while eating, writing while hoovering, cursing seagulls. What's worse, exposure or occlusion? Imperfect synonyms, imperfect antonyms, something so complicated you'll never be able to understand even the basic terms involved, something so simple you understood it a long time ago without even noticing. Days pass. I wondered, is it worth even breathing in spring's smithereens? Empty snail shell, worm stub retreat, green glass shark fin, beard hair split in three. Is it worth to feel something to a present not at extent? Lucky to live from work in the milky circle. Dear Ollie, how pleased I am to get your letter, sad as it is. Ollie, 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 what shall I say? What did you want to be when you were a boy? Ho, ho, what man are you this morning as you read this, and the labyrinth of your day complexes itself before you? Are you picking your nose or playing chess or scratching your head? Write and give me some idea of the texture of your happiness at this moment. My texts are green so that I may experience high levels of interest in Louis the Pious. In the diocese, I felt my interest returning, and yet Pater describes the transportation of soils from different regions to Richmond International Airport as a mixture of tiny brown, black, white, and beige dots, somehow expressed by the level of his waistband, which looks like a data center, and in fact must be, since more obvious ruptures in period detail don't upset or disturb, they comfort, in fact, since they ruin the experience of, and so on. Over there by the fence is another bird I don't know how to name. This is a little thing we have done together. We have a go at the grammar, the lines refuse to sequence around and want them all for the fruits they harbour. Limited to want everything. Rain, pip divoting, a pivoting breeze, in bright and open space, doodling in the centre of my life. I found myself loving some more than others, which gave me hope that I too might be wrong. I was wrong. I clapped and clapped, fumbling the orchestration, crackling water in the ear. Here I appear to await, which is when I thought of my friends most bitterly, Johannes, their proper names floating around like tiny cursors on my retina, provoking me into an act of refocusing. The way, for example, touching someone's skin and feeling very far away, not just from them, but from your own hand, which recedes as though backing away from an embarrassing mistake it could still get away with, can exhaust me enough to never want to do it again. True, sometimes I will simply list basic queries about the nature of my personality in order to allow for the possibility that it exists. Will I ever not be tired? Will I ever not be selfish? Will I give over any of my ample domestic space to a simple description of the face of one friend? The eruption of exactitude when her head turns, you know how it goes when you think about a name and a part of you cringes or squeezes itself inside you as though lightly injuring you into an awareness that you're not yet entirely done with childish feelings, with an appetite to let the discrepant tones, little dots of colour distribute themselves among you and to just lie yourself down to dry in the sun. The names, Johannes, you were thinking about the names for untrained hands, how best to pervert them so that they may be enjoyed by all uncomplicatedly and forever. We thought then too about writing a haiku about standing in a lake. No, I thought about a haiku about having paddled in a dappled lake, a sweet mistake, Traherne. But a pain in the centre of my back for a long time I had forgotten the cold brought out. On the 24th-ish, rain, pipe distribution, a breeze bright and open in the open, extracting the all from the refrain, I put the sigh in Versailles to verse, or worse, to work, to the poet is dead, and yet the poems remain excellent, even here among their friends. The meadows spread out over there like some kind of drastic condiment, a rhythm of presence and increasingly annoying presence, a routine of surprise belaboured until all that's left is pure inflation, the boing in ongoingness. So I'm going to pause that poem there bangs on for another kind of 30 pages or so. And I'm going to skip to the next poem that follows it in the book, which is called Post-Positivity in Spring, which is a fair bit shorter. So much for poetry and no more. Perpetual norm dawn raising its awning in purple pose for traffic to battle under galore. It's nice to imagine you sitting down to write me and putting it off. Not to owe is good, but to owe and be let off is better. Is that true, sweetie? Or shall I just talk over myself like rain overnight when the software update tunes me up to spit out wall-to-wall windsocks come morn? It's cool in the shade, warm in the collapse of the Avant Sun franchise, radiating out across the retooled day when nobody's allowed in, and none of these objects, the traffic, etc., are real and mean it. Face up to it. Enjambment is not going to sort your face out. Those were difficult days. That browser is no longer supported, but you know that. The policy may be that the screen you're writing on is not the screen you're reading. It goes something like the statement of fact connects us to a pin, and the pin refuses to refuse, and in fact spreads out everywhere as a knowledge slick. How else can it be put down? It's like there is no space to which to go, which is a property of space to aggressively annotate, even out here where it becomes untrue as either urge to love or not becomes untrue when pressed hard enough against yourself, like waves flattened against an upright pane of glass planted in the middle of the flood of subject. I'm just going to do a little cough. I didn't want to startle anyone. Excuse me. There's a group of isolated new words like incoming to step up on when the desire to anything is gone. This is the uninhabitable place after becomes now is the final line of this poem. And then the last, but now how many, aha. Funny, does it hurt less? It starts to hurt less. And then I'm going to skip forwards to a poem called Composed at Erdberg. Going forwards into zinc motes. I should say, before I start reading this one, the title comes from a note that Schubert wrote at the end of one of his compositions, which were 6 short dances called écossaises, which he composed while he was locked in a room by one of his kind of prankier friends. And the condition for him escaping this locked room was that he had to write a set of short compositions, which he did. And they're great. Composed at Erdberg. Going forwards into zinc motes, buggily humming a Maything song, I almost lurched to punch my own voice, crushingly loud in AirPods, cancelling the more of shuffled spruce, rushes, and larch. Before I or anyone knows, a yelp comes from our inbox out. What if the way of melancholy is via a fiddly melody, the basic idea of which is dead? She understands through melody the basic idea that you die, or the method of melancholia is an awkward song from which one basic idea has expired. If self-denunciation's juggling hexagonal piano patterns back to yourself in agog air too ornamental to be severe. Apostrophes as the poem starts to snow itself, as though apostrophes like snow begins to fall on poetry. Succumbing to the environment, giving into it, since to clock something partial is the payoff for being a person short of a person, the existential reward of being a short man alone, because it's a tense thing, not nothing, to feel about the freshness of the feel of HD spruce leaf. Probably time to doodle up a song you can look at or not. The pieces do not have tempo indications, and recordings have ranged from under 2 minutes to over 4 minutes in length for all 6. Scratching something irrational on noise, that is, scratching when you scratch with noise, that is, scratching while scratching something useless with useless sound. Not a waste to waste the fluorescing, misreading reach of a wren's rung routine. Until the shine comes on, it is misread as access to the mutilated warbler, one regular disgusting evening. Jay called again about the cosmetics. Despite his sweetness, he leaves a feeling in you. Sorting recycling in Eden. When in doubt, shout. The boxy rumble of one consoling form of indecision reverberating through June. Brush, brush. Playing it again in the bland toy landscape when in doubt. Literally just knocking about with you in the and of the inging room. And then I'll read one more, which is the title poem. Sleepers awake. It's the Yoka sky fragments, or the perma-yellow period pollutants in the brushwork you can't slate for. It's the child crooner approaching, demanding your day even while it's snowing. It's starting to skip, conceding the words are in place, the familiar refrain ruined by the potency of the awkward echo, the pareidolia in a visible voice note. Is what I do each morning along Argyle Street, the era's method, hidden in plain daylight's copyrightlessness, reduced to a grain of an origin yet to happen. It's those skinny tree shadows again, webbing the park rink like a cracked plate, basic, white cold day, slyly over 1,000 others over-promoted. It's your eyes, the phone you do. Is it sickness knocking me on the basics? It's snowing again. It's snowing heavily all over Glasgow, making everything naked and light, a face relaxed at last. At first, it's snuffed day sound echoes that you two only have to hear about distantly, to not know how it feels when you move always from room to day to early dusk, forced by forgetting, thinking, Siri, what even was I about to ask? What's wrong? It's the no ice in noticing, I sing, puff, puff, the airy you form of January, without rigor or shame, in gorgeous rouge sun, renting its blush from the sandstone, deepening into dusk as if embarrassed but pleased to be perceived. I wanted all of that for myself and you, buggy squeak, tight air, Kelvin slush, and easily more from which a gaping ear may nosh on a bad day. Blandness in cereal form, fat clouds over Campsie Fells in slow mosh, flat clouds, cowhides, an association I semi-designed in love for that designed feeling, its failure, impermanence. Later bits of snow slowly clearing themselves on the window, dittoing the dark day. They were there, here, glad to have sung it for you once. Thanks.
It was so great to hear those poems, and I found myself laughing again, even though I'd heard them read out before, which was a great testament to their effectiveness. I wanted to start by asking you about the kind of like the dress of the poems, and kind of Johannes, the kind of the Dear Ollie in the middle of, or towards the end of Progress Real and Imagined. And then we've also got the kind of the apostrophe in the snow. So my question is really kind of what kind of voices that you're thinking, what voices are you thinking about when you're writing this poem? I mean, what does Johannes mean to you, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember why the poem was addressed to Johannes as a name specifically, but I read this piece for the Car Connect blog a couple of weeks ago in which I was trying to work out why I address proper names that don't necessarily have a connection to actual historical people or people I know. And Johannes is one of those. And despite the fact that Johannes and the variants of the name Johannes that occur throughout the poem, like Johann and Joe and so on, doesn't kind of have this direct connection with a specific individual. It's a name which is really rich with associations for me and probably for everybody, like variants upon Johannes and John and so on. It extends in all kinds of directions culturally and personally. Everybody knows a John or a Johannes, I'm sure. And I think it was that kind of slightly like over saturated quality of the name that partly appeals, where like the associations that the name generates are so abundant that it almost becomes evacuated of sense. It becomes almost neutral, a kind of placeholder name to be addressed. And I think like proper names of different kinds occur throughout the book. Andre and Jay and Anna and so on, all people I don't know, which are kind of blended together with names of actual poets and actual friends of mine. And I think I was kind of partly interested in addressing proper names because at the same time as writing this, I was writing a novel which was a single sentence addressed to a letter, the letter A. And while there was something, inviting about that kind of writing situation where I'm addressing an addressee who doesn't have the kind of contours of a person in the social world, like the letter A, it doesn't. That was kind of enabling in lots of ways. I kind of missed names, and I think I missed the social context of writing that proper names generated. So I think that's probably one of the impulses behind it. But yeah, there is that moment where where I kind of address myself, and the language in that passage, given that you mentioned him at the beginning, is entirely drawn from W.S. Graham's letters to others, which you can probably tell from the voice, which is suddenly extremely assertive. I kind of imagine being spoken back to by him as I'm trying to develop this long poem. For me, he's one of those poets who's a constant presence in my ear, kind of annotating what I'm writing as I'm going along. So it was nice to just like incorporate that directly into the body of the poem.
Yeah, I love that idea that you've got these kind of constant voices in your ear, because that's kind of how it reads on the page when you kind of note, I think, Mayer or Oppen, or these like poets that you're not necessarily like kind of citing, but thinking with, or you're kind of overhearing, hearing with at a moment like that. Is that, yeah, kind of how you imagine?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, particularly I do take a phrase from Oppen, who is an amazing builder of long poems in particular, but also Mayer, she was a kind of like tutelary spirit for me for like the entire book in the sense that she, along with other second generation New York School poets like Alice Notley, managed to write these extraordinary long poems while involved in domestic life and thinking about the experience of being with children a lot. So Mayer is kind of like everywhere in the poem and nowhere in particular. So yeah, but there's definitely a kind of like team of poets that were important to me during the time I was writing this book, and Graham, Oppen, and Mayer are definitely up there.
Yes, I feel like you can kind of hear those resonances, and I just wondered, like you've written kind of several long poems, and just what does that space feel like when you're writing it, or kind of what kind of possibilities are opened up by the long poem that that you find a kind of, I suppose the kind of temporal possibilities, but also kind of thinking about kind of dialogues and thinking through, longer periods of time?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed. I mean, the one I read from at the start was an intensely pleasurable experience writing it. Which was kind of from the winter of 2019 through to the summer of 2020. And I think unusually, or like for me, for the first time, it didn't have a predetermined constraint or a form that I kind of established in advance. And it became like, as I was writing it, I sent it to a friend who runs a great press called Spam in Glasgow, Maria Sledmere, and she said that she would publish it and that there was a kind of deadline for me to finish it. So essentially, it was a kind of durational work where I just knew I would have to stop writing when it got to the point where I'd have to send it to Maria. So, I mean, that's one of the things that appeals about Maya in particular, like in a work like Midwinter Days, and in other of her works where she uses, rather than a formal, as in like kind of textual or structural constraint for her longer works, she uses time as a determinant a lot of the time. So yeah, that's what I was doing here. And one of the kind of freeing things about that was it felt like it was really capacious as a space. I could put anything in because there wasn't this central principle for inclusion or exclusion of material. It just felt like whatever happened during that time was legit as like potential content for the poem. And as I was writing it, I was also interested in things that I was discovering about for myself for the first time about writing long poems, which were these things which are obviously familiar from other long poems that we're familiar with. The possibilities of kind of an internal dialectic going on within a poem where it kind of disagrees with itself and like advances an implicit argument. Like refrains, like musicality is really important there as well. Like if anything, sound is is one principle which organizes the whole thing. Just like a feeling of like raggedness to it, which was enabled by this kind of, for me, pleasurable deferral of ending and conclusion. Like that was great. I was sad when I had to stop writing it. And also, like, the worst thing about it is it's completely ruined short poems for me. Like, I have no idea how to do that anymore.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're all sad when we have to stop reading it. So you should, the long poem that keeps on going. But I was wondering about that, kind of returning to Between the Windows, and thinking about the ways in which the short poem used to be slightly more kind of your form, and now the long poem, the kind of freedom of it works so well for what you do. I wanted to just, since we were still on kind of Progress Will Imagine, just kind of ask you about the kind of Nicol Eisenman painting, which is like a, from memory, a diptych. You've got kind of the artist studio on the one hand, and then there's kind of epic representation of Progress Will Imagined in kind of contemporary American life, perhaps. And I suppose what the ways in which that kind of maybe opened up some questions or became an object to think with.
Yeah, I mean, it's they're both extraordinary paintings, but I've only ever seen one in real life, which was the one where there's this kind of chaotic depiction of an artist studio, as you say, or like a kind of impossible artist studio in which all of art history, or a lot of it, seems to be kind of collapsing upon the head of the central figure from above in this like kind of chaotic citational practice that Eisenman has, in which like seemingly incompatible aesthetics are allowed to coexist within the space of their painting, which is one of her one of their amazing facilities as a painter, is to be able to do that. And that painting in particular is the one that I like, the image that I had in mind when I was thinking about it during the poem. But I also like the fact that there is this second painting which has an identical title and is very different in style. There's, it's a kind of boshy landscape with all kinds of like mischief going on in it, which is amazing. And like the one moment where I turn towards the paintings in the poem, there's a kind of double encounter with the painting, and the two encounters kind of like satirize one another, or like refuse to agree with one another, which again I think is one of the appealing things about Eisenman's work generally, is that it seems to continue to be like pranking itself, and like the way it advances or develops, or regresses strategically and fruitfully, is by like attacking itself, in like often really hilarious ways. They're an incredibly funny painter. So yeah, but like when I first saw the painting of the studio, it was the most. It kind of reminded me. It generated the same experience that I got when I first read John Ashbery's The Skaters, which it kind of looks like that poem in lots of ways, in the sense that there's, I spoke about kind of incompatible aesthetics, but there's this feeling of a suspension in the painting where everything seems to be flying around inside the studio, but then it's also a houseboat which is kind of adrift at sea, where there's this kind of tussle going on between sailors in the margins of the painting. There's a huge amount going on. I could just talk about it all evening, but yeah, it was just this kind of like frantic interest in the painting that I experienced when I first saw it, and I wanted to kind of carry in the poem.
Yeah, no, it's a great description of it. And just very kind of briefly, just when you were talking about the Hazzard painting, I was thinking about like the lyrical and conceptual elements in your poems, and the ways in which you kind of move between those registers so kind of like nimbly. And I wondered whether that's something you're kind of like conscious of, or that's something that, like somewhat a critic comes and kind of frames the work. But and there is that internal kind of tension which makes the poetry exciting, because it's constantly moving between those registers, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's always been a question that I've been interested in, and I've always found and appropriated text alongside text I produce myself in a more conventional way, and tried to combine the two. But like in my last book, often there was a bit of a visual distinction between them when they appeared in poems. So like the kind of my first, like I did a like mid-length poem in my last book, called Gwraig sa Verden, or Edmund's Tump, which was a kind of wargame poem. And that is a prosimetrum. It uses like paragraphs of found text and then intersperses like botched poems of my own in between those paragraphs of found text, which was drawn largely from an online Ramblers forum. And while I like the kind of interplay between found and like written text, I was slightly, I think, unsatisfied moving beyond that with that kind of distinction between them. So I think like in this book, I've tried to like smush them together a little bit, to use the technical term, and like have them be more difficult to distinguish from one another and be a bit more entangled, which feels more accurate as a way of thinking about how those two types of text actually interact in my life generally.
Great, thanks so much. I'm just going to move on to the kind of Q&As now. So I've got a question from Beverly Brahick, who says, how much editing goes into the writing of, say, the long poem you began with? First phrase, best phrase, or, and do you set constraints like brackets Aleppo before you begin?
Yeah, I mean, I edited the long poem quite a lot, and the rest of them as well, like more than I have in the past, and even the shorter ones have taken me a long time, and I think that probably could have gone on for a while longer if I hadn't had to finish it. But I think also like in terms of deciding when like poems editing is done, like a few of these poems are specifically tied to their specific temporal context. Like, there's like timestamps throughout the book, and often they refer to events that were happening concurrently as I was writing them. So sometimes I would get to a point where it was like several months after the kind of originally context for a poem or the stimulus had passed, and it felt like I could no longer like write in an informed way about it. But yeah, aside from that, I don't, in terms of constraint, aside from the kind of durational constraint that I mentioned at the beginning, not really in this one. I mean, there's a very loose constraints, and just in terms of like I use syllabics sometimes, and like haiku, and the final poem is in 16 like 4-line stanzas, 4 of them in each section of the poem. But beyond that, nothing too imaginative this time.
It's all very imaginative. Another question from Royston Tester: do you ever find that a painting becomes itself a palette of mirrors, say, throwing you off or into new spaces?
Yeah, that's a nice way of thinking about the way like prolonged exposure or time spent with a poem can affect you. I think particularly with the Eisenman one, that's definitely the case, partly because it's so rich and there are so many different forms of mirroring that happen within it, both like in relation to the painting and you as an observer, but also internally within the dynamics of the painting. But also like the painting that's on the front of the book is this really beautiful one by a Glasgow painter called Andrew Cranston. And this is a painting of the pond that used to be in the National Museum in Edinburgh, and then was the fish were then transported to the Glasgow Botanic Gardens. And Andy's painted the same image over and over again over years. And this final iteration of it, if it is the final one, is a vast canvas, having started it on a hardback book cover. And that's an image that I've spent a lot of time with, and has like lots of different moods contained with it. And it's really responsive to me when I'm in kind of thinking about different things. And I think it's partly one of the things that the painting is about. Like, it's this really intricate grid where each individual tile has different colors, like minute gradations of yellow and white and red, but it's also warped in really amazing ways by the kind of water that's implicitly in the pond but never actually visible. And that does have that kind of mirror-like effect, which I like as a way of thinking about paintings.
Great. There isn't another question at the moment, but please do type ahead. I want to just, maybe we could go back to that question about titles, since you kind of gave me the Erdberg and the Schubert kind of anecdote, which was kind of amazing. So that was Schubert who composed it in Lot Rome, right? And yeah, go, and all of these other kind of wild titles that I struggle to pronounce.
Yeah, I mean, they're quite silly, the titles, a lot of them. But yeah, the Schubert one is, it's particularly comical, the like pieces that he produced, because they're these really like energetic dances for like numerous people to be dancing simultaneously. And I quite liked that, the idea of someone in forced solitude, like imagining this, like, orchestrating the dance of imagined bodies. But yeah, like they're mainly silly though, Jess, like particularly the one that you failed to pronounce, which I also don't know how to pronounce. I suppose ding ding dingadict, I suppose, is how I'd have a crack at it, which is like the dingadict is like a thing poem, Rilke's thing poem. And I suppose it starts with ding. So I want to repeat that sound.
Right. Okay. So this, I mean, the sound is always like, the sound drives so much of the poem, right? The poems. Yes. And I guess what I'm kind of interested in your wordplay, like there's just some amazing kind of dances with words and kind of names. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about your kind of process in thinking through those sounds as you're writing these poems.
Yeah, I mean, play is probably it. Like one of the things that comes up throughout the book is like humming and doodling. And one of my favorite recent essays by a poet, which I was reading while writing this, was Angela Layton has got an amazing book called Hearing Things, really beautiful. And she's got this amazing essay on Tennyson's hum, and the way in which Tennyson includes humming in his work. And there's one passage in it in which she describes humming as a form of oral doodling, which I just love as a description of that activity. Partly because it's a way of thinking about ways in which sound that doesn't necessarily have clear semantic content is also, it works in other poets that I enjoy, like John Clare's The Switching Bird song and things like that. But I think that impulse to be led by sound is a form of play in the space of a poem, which I kind of allowed myself in this book because I really enjoyed it. But it was also about the conditions in which a lot of it was written. I have young children, and I was spending a lot of time with them while writing these poems, often while I was with them, when I probably should have been looking after them better. But I was, listening to them, particularly at the stages where they were pre-verbal, but also full of melody and full of sound. And also when they started being able to hold a pen and started spending their days scribbling and doodling, this kind of intuitive, incredibly expressive, artistic practice that they kind of produced themselves was kind of inspirational for a lot of these poems. So I think that particularly with someone like Tennyson, his attention to sound and his willingness to include wordplay in his poems has often led to his reputation being slightly mixed. Auden called him the best stupid poet or something like that, wasn't it? Because he was he liked sounding good, and was deemed to be non-rigorous because of that. But yeah, so I suppose that's one of the ways in which sound operates.
And I feel like sometimes you're kind of leaning into that or playing up the silliness of the performance of the sound, and so which makes it kind of humorous, but also kind of kind of these moments where it also kind of breaks through in the long poem especially. And I was just thinking it was a beautiful description talking about your kind of young children and their own kind of melodies feeding into the poems. And I was just thinking back to what you were saying about kind of Bernadette Mayer being this kind of really important presence. And I wondered whether, what the kind of the rhythms of childcare and the rhythms of writing poetry. And I think you had potentially a lever hum or something to work on fatherhood and poetry, or kind of something to do with kind of childcare. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I've just gone back to work in January after just over a year off, and we've got Lucy and I have a nearly 2-year-old daughter, so I got to spend a lot of time with her during that time. That was when I was finishing the shorter poems in the book. But yeah, the kind of atmosphere and the soundscape of having children about is really important to every piece in here. And I think probably not Alice Notley as much as Maya is important for them. I've been kind of reading her obsessively for a couple of years, but particularly her works in which she includes the voices of her children. She's got this wonderful long poem called January, where she transcribed everything she could of her 2 sons' speech for an entire month, and then built this poem out of it. And it's kind of a dialogue between her own authorial voice and her children, but they kind of blend together. And the children's utterances seem essentially like they're written by Gertrude Steiner, extraordinary children. But that was hugely enabling for me, in the sense that it was a kind of way of tuning my own attention to my environment in a way that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise, and for which I'm hugely grateful to those poets in particular.
Yeah. And just to kind of wheel back to the John Clare and these kind of like spring references, am I right to think there's also quite a kind of Clarish kind of element or some kind of undertone working through the poems? And yeah, I think I found it very exciting to be in this kind of space of often kind of office space and then chartered space, and also this kind of moment of really kind of experimenting with something that's not the pastoral, but it's certainly a kind of idea of what kind of nature can be, and it's real kind of inhabiting the present in that way.
Yeah, I mean, Claire is one of the poets I love the most, and one of the things I was thinking about with him, and have been for a while, is his misspellings have always been one of the most interesting features of his poems, because often the misspellings are themselves really expressive. And so I think like one of the things that I was trying to work out when writing these poems was how to navigate those different kinds of space that you're describing, just like and how they like they're either like hard borders between them, between like work life and domestic life, and different forms of social space. And of course, like as everybody knows right now, like the division between work and non-work life, it doesn't really exist anymore. But one of the things that Claire does is he navigates space in really interesting ways in his poem, partly by kind of mistaking time for space sometimes. Like he sometimes writes there for then, and here for then as well. So like there's a sense in which the space and time in his poems are partly kind of, he jumps from one dimension to another through misspelling and through kind of non-normative English usage. And again, that seemed connected to the kind of possibilities made available when seeing a child starting to learn language. That like they seem kind of connected, those two different things. But yeah, I feel like I've digressed a little bit from the question.
Well, I think we're at time, and that was a beautiful answer, and I hope that you'll write more on Claire. Thank you so much. I feel that was, I have learned a lot, and I'm sure others have too. And thanks again for that beautiful reading.
Well, thank you, Jess.
Thank you both so much. Like that's one of those hours that just flew by. I can't believe that we've been here since 7 p.m. It was so good to hear you read those poems. Like, yeah, I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. And congratulations, of course, Ollie. And thank you guys for being here and for your messages and your questions. I've put the link in the chat again. Please do go buy a copy of the book. You've got a discount code you can use there, and it'll come as an email tomorrow. So there's plenty of time to get more copies and use your code. So the last thing for me to say is please join us again next time. Our next online launch is on the 13th of March. We're launching Victoria Kenefick's new book, Eggshell, and that's in the chat as well, and you can sign up to our newsletter so that you don't miss it and stuff. So that's everything. Oh, thanks for all your messages. It's been really great. Congratulations, and yeah, goodbye.